Welcome back, parents. I think there was a conversation starter, actually, before I went to the Dominican Republic. I pre-recorded one.
So it hasn't been that long.
Hasn't been that long, but welcome back to another conversation starter. Pastor Mario.
Dawson, the youth leader.
Dawson, the youth leader. And so we're excited to be kind of getting back into the groove here. Dawson got married, as everyone here knows.
Yes.
So it's been busy. I was out of the country, you were getting married, youth group was kind of, it was on and then it was off and then it was on and it was off, which, this coming week, update, there will be no youth group this Wednesday because we had the summer bash on Sunday, which kind of took the place of youth group for this week, which was great. It was a great turnout. We had a few new kids, so that was pretty fun.
Yeah.
But all that to say, we are going to be having a conversation starter this week for you parents because we're starting to get to talking about some really good stuff as we're kind of finishing up Genesis this summer, which is going to be so great to be done. We've been going through this for like 8 months.
Yeah. And the kids will have officially read all of Genesis.
All of Genesis, which is
cool.
50 whole chapters of the Old Testament, that's a big deal.
Yeah, definitely.
So for the summer, we're going through the life of Joseph. We're calling the series From Gloom to Glory. And it's all centered because the last few chapters of Genesis all center on Joseph. And so this past Wednesday, we honed in on chapter 37 of Genesis, which is more like the introduction to Joseph's life. Yeah. We're introduced to him, we're introduced to, and him and his brothers are all sons of Jacob, who was the son of Isaac, who was the son of Abraham.
Still in the line of promise.
Still in the line of promise, which later on in Genesis, we actually find that all the tribes of Israel come from these 12 siblings. Yeah. And so this is pretty big deal stuff. But we're introduced to Joseph, and the introduction is kind of a dramatic one. Right, we're introduced to him as the youngest brother. It actually gives specification that he's 17 years old. He's very young, he's youth group age, and, he's very immature. He's like having these dreams from God, and he's like taunting his brothers like, I'm gonna rule over you one day. And
he's gonna rule over their dad, which is
rule over their dad.
Over the edge.
Yep, his dad gets mad at him, like, what are you talking about? Yeah. Don't do that. And so it's kind of like dramatic. It's like any other family. It's like with teenagers.
Don't tell your brothers that.
Yeah, literally. And don't tell me that. And so it's just, you have this like very almost like realistic family dynamic that we're introduced to. But then things take a really harsh turn later in the chapter when his brothers, out of jealousy, want to actually kill their brother. Like, let's kill him. Yeah. And that's more than just dramatic. This is now a very serious sin. Yeah. And we can see kind of the heart of the brothers is like, we hate this brother. We hate Joseph. Yeah. We want to get rid of Joseph. And so after a whole thing of events, they actually don't kill him, but they sell him into slavery. And so you have this 17-year-old teen who is sold into slavery, international slavery. Yeah. I mean, like to a different nation.
Yeah, it is. It's like different nations, traders are coming in, and the brothers see them and decide to sell him instead of. Literally, they say, like, we might as well get, then the blood won't be on our hands.
The blood won't be on our hands.
Might as well just get rid of him.
Yeah.
They probably do think he's still going to die.
Yep.
They're still wiping their hands of him, but they just don't want the actual burden of having killed him. And so, he's getting sold not just to some other family where he could potentially find his brothers again. Like, he's out of the country. Like, he's out
of the country. And you made the good point of highlighting to the students, this was an enemy nation. Yeah. This was a nation that, this was Egypt. Yeah. Which for Israel, if you read on, later on in the beginning of Exodus, you find out why this is such a big deal. Yeah. But
in general, Jacob's line, they didn't have many friends. And we even saw that in Jacob's life.
Yeah.
They were pretty hostile to other nations because God had told them to be.
Yeah.
But in return, nations were pretty hostile to them. So one of Jacob's sons getting sold somewhere, like, again, his brothers probably thought he was going to die. Like, there was a lot of hostility. Yeah. It wasn't like them being like, yeah, we'll take care of him. You know?
Nope. Yeah, they still had every intention that he was gonna die. Yeah. They just didn't want.
He was out of their hands at that point.
Yeah.
They were done with it.
They just didn't want the blood on their hands, and it literally says that.
Yeah.
It's like the blood won't be on our hands.
Yeah.
And so, and then they do it, and I mean, like, I'm even thinking at the end of Genesis when Joseph is going through this event again, he starts to say, and we'll get to it, but he says things like, and you didn't stop when I was even yelling out.
Yeah.
Like, so you have this picture of Joseph, a teenager, like yelling at his brothers, like, no, stop. Yeah. You know, it's just like heartbreaking.
Yeah.
And it just brings it home to the reality that this was a real person who went through a deep tragedy because of their brothers, a deep betrayal of his family. And, you know, his brothers go home and they tell their dad, like, hey, look, like an animal ate Joseph.
Yeah.
And his dad is in complete despair.
Yeah, and just grief, like.
Yeah.
I love the biblical description of grief when they instantly tear their clothes. And like, it's very melodramatic, but it is what happens.
Yeah.
Jacob hears and he just can't. Like, there's no reaction that he has other than to just fall down, completely grieving.
It even says that they tried to console him, but he rejected it.
Yeah.
And he's like, no, I'm going to go down to the grave with my son.
Yeah.
And man, that's like, it's hard.
Yeah.
It brings it home.
So it's a tough first chapter.
Very tough introduction, which is why, you know, the series is called From Gloom to Glory. Yeah. It starts with some very gloomy, stuff here in Joseph's life. Yeah. But, you know, when we were doing the teaching, we encouraged the students, listen, we're going through this very slowly, because whenever we hear, and you made some really good points on this, so I'd love for the parents to hear what you were saying about it. But like, when we usually present the story of Joseph, you know, in children's church or in Sunday school class or in youth group or whatever the case, whenever we explain it to the younger generation, we bypass like the suffering and we rush to the ending to say like, oh, but look, Joseph's okay and he saved everybody and he's a king, you know, he's like, and like we mention the tidbit of suffering, but we focus more on like the glory, which is good because, you know, because of Joseph, the entire nation of Israel was saved. But for Joseph in this time, it's not fast forwarding. For him in his life, when he's sold into slavery, he can't just turn the page.
He's in it. He's going through it.
He's in it, and this suffering is going to take a long time. And it isn't until like 30 years later that he actually does get to that glorified, you know, situation.
And it's very easy for us to skip forward. And even like this story, you know, we've looked at Genesis kind of with the through line of like this line and God's faithfulness and how he's building this promise. And like Joseph still exists in that. And his story is an incredible story of faithfulness, but it starts in a situation where he can't see God at all. Like, he's thrown into a pit and then he's pulled out of the pit and he's probably like, God's saving me, and he's thrown into slavery. Like, he doesn't see God working in this scenario at all. And so for us reading, yes, we can have the perspective knowing what comes next, but sometimes we should allow ourselves to step into that more sympathetic role and read it from the perspective of, man, he's really going through, you know, like it'll make that glory that much more fulfilling if we take it slow and we acknowledge what Joseph actually went through, as opposed to skipping the parts where God's not present for when he is, because we find out at the end that he was present the whole time. And so reading it with the perspective of, okay, God's not mentioned here, but God's working here is kind of what we're trying to do, why we're taking it slow.
Yep.
And it's why this first chapter, even though it's like everyone knows this stuff, but when you just read this little section, it kind of hits a little harder.
Yeah.
Then in the midst of the grand story, you see why he had to end up in Egypt. But when you're reading just this section, it's just a 17-year-old being sold into slavery by his own family, who, like, you know, he knew he annoyed, but he didn't know his brothers hated him. You know, like, and he even has these pre-existing promises that he will rule over them, which he believes. He trusts God when God gives him those dreams. And so he's probably expecting that to be soon. Yeah. You know, like, he doesn't see all of this suffering coming.
He can't see it all. Yeah. And I think that is, such a good point, where it's like you go slowly through it. And this is what we told the kids, is like, just acknowledge what Joseph went through was wrong. Yeah. And just sit there. Yeah. Just sit in it. Yeah. It's kind of like the difference between like a movie and a series. Yeah. Which, you know, this isn't a movie and this isn't a series. This is a very real event. But when you watch a movie, you know, you grow close to the characters. You're like, oh, wow, their story is really cool. But in 2 hours, you get to the ending, and you're like, oh, wow, okay, cool. Yeah. But with a series, when there's breaks and there's times and there's seasons, and, you know, you got to wait a whole season to figure out, oh, man, does that person make it out well? And then when they do, like, you've had all this time of, like, anxiety and waiting and, like, wow, like, this makes it so much better in the long run. Yeah. And that's what this is. It's like going in piece by piece and just being in each piece as if being there with Joseph, and just kind of, okay, this was hard. Yeah. Let me try to relate to Joseph on this.
Yeah, and just seeing it as a real event.
Yes.
Like, Joseph is a Bible story. But it's also a real event. And so, like, taking these chapters out of the context of the story and not telling it as one full story in one go, we can try and hone in on the reality of it and on the reality of Joseph as a person and what he went through, and how he was able to call on God the whole time, even though he was going through terrible stuff. You know, like, and that's what we're trying to kind of hammer home, is like, don't skip to the part where Joseph is redeemed. And when you reread the chapter, don't skip to the part where Joseph is redeemed.
Don't skip.
really acknowledge what he's gone through, and acknowledge how God can still be good through it. Yeah. Without using the redemption at the end, you know, like.
Yeah, I mean, it's really beneficial, right? And we're gonna leave you guys with questions to go through in your conversation time, devotional time. But that's really it, like, because in our life, when suffering comes, we can't just skip past. Yeah. It happens in real time, and it takes time. Yeah. And in those times, we are in the suffering, and it's hard to kind of see the redemption of this moment while you're in it. Yeah. So why don't you read the first one?
Question time.
Question time, baby.
Little transitions.
Yeah.
But with the idea in mind of, like, Joseph as a story. Yep. The first question to ask your student, and really yourself, like, you know, this is a family discussion.
Yeah.
But, like, ask yourself, like, why is it difficult to see Joseph as a real person who really went, like, not even just historical figure, like, person who went through these things? Like, why is it so hard to do that instead of just reading it as a story?
Yeah. Yeah.
And obviously, it's like a easy answer to it is because we hear it a lot.
Yeah.
With these stories that we hear all the time, it's really easy to dehumanize the people in them and kind of lose sight of, you know, like, they're the heroes of faith, and the heroes of faith were just kind of, you know, early Christians.
Yeah.
So it's like they were also people trying to follow God, going through hard things, you know, like, and so I think that again, through taking it slowly, we can try and look at them as human beings, as opposed to these Bible characters where it's like, yeah, he was sold into slavery, whatever, God got him out of it.
It really does help it make a connection of like, okay, this is a real person, but also understanding how you're saying like, I need to understand why I can't, if I'm having trouble seeing Joseph as a real person who went through something terrible, then there's something blocking my way of like, okay, maybe I just think that this is just a book of tales, or maybe I just think like, this is just a story that I read in church.
There can be some self-reflection there too.
Self-reflection, some heart work. And so, that would be just a very general question that I think to ask your student. It's not intimidating. It's just more of like, okay, like you've heard the story, why is it so hard to connect with Joseph on this front? And we might be surprised some of the answers that we get from our students. The second one is more for you, parents, rather than just for your student, which your student can answer too, and I would encourage you to ask them. But it's more of a chance for you to share with your student and open up about, times in your life where you've gone through a season of suffering and you don't necessarily see, or I should say you can't see God's sovereignty or God's goodness or God's hand of protection on you in that particular moment. So the question is, describe a time of suffering in your life where at the time you couldn't see God's hand of protection, but when you look back on it, having gone through it, you can. Yeah. And really that's highlighting the point in the story where Joseph, like God is not mentioned in this chapter. No. But in Acts chapter 7, when Stephen is giving testimony about the gospel and he goes through all of Israel's history, he gets to Joseph and he says that Joseph was sold into slavery, but God was with him. And so that part isn't mentioned in Joseph's story. But when someone looks back on it, they can say, oh, but God was indeed with him. And so I think that's an important lesson for the students, but to be able to hear from you, the parents, hey, when I was your age or just recently, I was struggling with this, or I went through a time of season like this, or, the loss of our grandmother or the loss of my, sister. That was a really hard time. I couldn't see God, anything. You guys know your guys' story as a family and everything, but take that time to really just be vulnerable with your student and see where that leads. And of course, reread chapter 37 and only chapter 37.
Yeah. Don't rush it. If they do have a response, awesome. If they don't have a response, just use your story to, show them another example of this happening.
Absolutely.
Because one of the parts of us kind of making that disconnect between scripture and the real world is that we might not get the same gravity as they might get from you sharing your story.
Exactly.
And and if you want to help them identify a time, again, where it could be something your whole family went through, and you can say, well, I know you were going through this and you were guided through that. Yeah. You can kind of walk them through that as well. But the main point is your testimony. Relating it to Joseph, but really just showing that same attitude of God not being mentioned or shown, but you can look back and say, he was there. Yeah. Yep.
I think that's great. Yeah. So, parents, I hope you were encouraged by this conversation starter.
General something.
That's the generate, because I still have the sermon from Sunday in my mind, so I was going to say generation. So, so I hope you were benefited by this. I hope it leads to great spiritual conversation, and we look forward to spending some more time with the youth. But this week, there is no youth service, so we won't see the youth, the students, until next week. I think July 6th is when the next youth group will be. So
7 o'clock.
At 7 o'clock on Wednesday.
Wednesdays now.
Yes, yep. And 5 p.m. if you want to come play pickleball and basketball. Yeah. So, all right. Well, we'll see you guys soon. Hello, parents. This is Pastor Mario. Thank you guys for joining us for this week's conversation starter. If you want more, ways that you can engage with your youth. You could check out the other conversation starters here on my side. Thank you guys for joining us. Hope you guys are doing well.